Good morning. Today is July 5th, 2020, and we're back at home, folks. Back at home, recording from home, and sitting at home, hopefully accessing home worship, maybe venturing out to other churches' offerings. We need to stay home. We know we're wearing our masks and washing our hands, and the pandemic worsens in our community, and we've got to stay home. So this morning, the message still comes through to us from Jesus. No matter what's going on outside of our doors or in our community or in our governments or in our families, Jesus still has a word of grace for us, and we are being released from a lot by the passage for this morning. So without further ado, let's get started. Matthew chapter 26, verses 6 through 13. When Jesus was at Bethany visiting the house of Simon, who had a skin disease, a woman came to him with a vase made of alabaster containing very expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' head while he was sitting at dinner. Now, when the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why this waste? This perfume could have been sold for a lot of money and given to the poor." But Jesus knew what they were thinking. He said, "Why do you make trouble for the woman? She's done a good thing for me. You always have the poor with you, but you won't always have me. By pouring this perfume over my body, she's prepared me to be buried. I tell you the truth, that whenever in the whole world this good news is announced, what she's done will also be told in memory of her." The gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. All that waste, and the poor will always be with you. What we recognize is that the poor are here to teach us something about what it means to be human, that Jesus included the marginalized, the poor, the sick, the excluded, those who were considered sinners. He ate with them, he ministered to them, he did healings. And we know that in our world today, and even in Jesus' time, the working poor are vulnerable. In our world today, they're vulnerable to the virus. They can't work from home. They live in conditions where the virus spreads, and they do not have access to adequate health care. So what are we to do about this extravagant waste and this message by Jesus that the poor will always be with you? And do they relate to one another? I would say that this passage has always been troubling for me. It's always been something that I've questioned. Why did Jesus say the poor, you have the poor, you always have the poor, but I won't always be here? Doesn't Jesus want us to eradicate poverty? Yes. So for the person who's working with the poor the most in our church, I asked Reverend Betty Kinnis to do a testimony about what it means to have the poor with us.
Today I want to tell you a story, a true story, real life story about a real life person that I know. But first, before I do that, I want to share with you from Matthew 26:11, where Jesus says to his disciples, "The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me." And Emily said, what do you think Jesus means when he says, "The poor you will always have with you"? What is he saying there? And I guess evidently, despite our best efforts, we will never eradicate poverty. So if we can't get rid of it, should we just accept it for what it is? Is Jesus suggesting that we just ignore the poor? I believe that's quite contrary. Perhaps because there have always been those among God's people who are poor. God has always been concerned about them. God is always concerned about the poor in both the Old and the New Testament. And we can read in Leviticus 19:10 some of God's provisions for the poor. He said, "Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor. I am the Lord your God." That's a commandment. And then in Leviticus 23:22, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor. I am the Lord your God." And there are many, many places in Scripture where God tells us we are to take care of the poor, help provide for the poor. In fact, when Jesus says the poor will always be with you in Matthew, he's alluding to a pronouncement that God made to Moses. In Deuteronomy 15:11, where God says to Moses, there will always be poor people in the land. There will always be poor people in the land. It's a matter of fact. But listen to what God tells Moses. "Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your brothers and sisters and toward the poor and needy in your land." That's the kind of attention that God expects from us, for others. And so now to my story. I want to tell you about a friend of mine who's part of the working poor Jesus is talking about in this passage. Through no fault of his own, he was born with an anxiety disorder. His parents divorced and he lived with his mom. Because of his disorder, it has been very hard for him to find a good paying job with full-time hours. Even a job that pays more than $9 or $10 an hour for 30 or 35 hours a week. So he depended on his mother for housing. But his mother decided she was done dealing with the situation. She was tired of it. She wanted out. And she sold the condo they were living in and left town, leaving him to figure things out on his own. When I met him, he was living in his car, trying to find a job with no luck, and panhandling for gas and food money. The Palm Beach Gardens police saw he needed help, and knowing that we help people in this kind of situation, told us about him. Because we were able to help him with some basic needs, he was able to get a job, but a job that paid him less than $900 a month. So still, he had to live in his car. He went to interviews for better jobs, but nothing ever came to it. Then, this spring, like so many other businesses, the parts store he was working for closed down because of the COVID virus and left him living in his car with no place to go to get relief. He came to me frantic. I did what I could. Learning that Publix was hiring, he applied and was hired no more than 30 hours a week for $10 an hour. And then he found a second job, taking tolls on the turnpike whenever they needed him for $9 an hour. So he was working 2 part-time jobs. And come to find out today that he has to give up one of those jobs because neither one of them will work out the schedule for him. Now, the fact that he was able to find 2 part-time jobs and make some money may sound like a happy ending. And he is thankful that he has work and for all the things the church has done for him. But you know, that's not the end of the story. His car broke down. He had health problems, as most people who live on a limited income because they can't afford health care. He feels the only break he gets is the help the church has given him. When Jesus talks about the poor, who will always be among us, this is who he's talking about. And when God says, therefore I command you to be open-handed towards your brothers and sisters and toward the poor and needy in your land, this is the kind of attention God expects from us for others. Because you see, God sees all of us as children and calls us to see Jesus in everyone. I recall that something in Matthew also where Jesus talks about whatever you have done to the least of these, you have done to me. We're called to have an open hand to the poor, to help to lift them up. Let us remember. Amen.
So this extravagant pouring of perfume and this pronouncement about the poor, the conclusion that Bell comes to, Rob Bell in the Jesus H. Christ podcast, is that efficiency may not be God's highest goal for your life. Production may not be God's highest goal for your life. Success defined by this world that we live in, by the tribe we find ourselves in, by the set that we run with, may not be God's highest goal for your life. When that woman pours the oil all over him, what he's saying is that the intention and the effort is sacred. Pragmatism and production and efficiency should not be equated with what is divine or sacred. He's releasing us from this idea that efficiency is our highest goal in life, that production is the only thing we're valuable for. Questions like, what are your measurable goals, are always asked in the modern church, but never relevant to the spiritual walk with Jesus. The disciples ask the question, and they're on the same team. Why all this a waste? And Jesus says, it's not a waste. It is sacred. And we are bringing a testimony to the world from the church that is against the kind of action that Jesus blesses in this passage. And Jesus says, all this waste is a good thing. Extravagant love, grace, abundance, rather than scarcity. We so often act as a testimony to some theory of a zero-sum game. You're either in or you're out. You're either with us or you're against us. You're either successful by the metrics or you're not. And Jesus is saying, throw out the metrics and be extravagant and loving. And sometimes it's the church that perpetuates this idea of efficiency and metrics and what are you producing? And the idea is breaking an alabaster jar over the heads of the people we walk among. And that's what Jesus wants us to do. Pour out extravagant grace and love on our neighbors, on our fellows. When our efforts that we put a lot of our work into, especially in the church, don't turn out the way we think they should, and we're faced with what we see as failure, the metrics don't measure up. It didn't turn out like I thought it would. If we can look back and discover that our intention and our effort was indeed sacred, we can see God working in it. But first we need to be free. We need to free ourselves of this goal of perfection, efficiency, production, industriousness. I made that word up, I think. That's why the goal of some of the New Testament writers in the epistles wasn't metrics and success and numbers and results. It was fruit. Have they fruit? And we have equated fruit in the epistles with results and metrics. And these are not the same thing. You can't eat results. You can't be nourished from results. You can't recover from diseases with results, but you can with fruit. You can be nurtured. And it takes cultivation and patience to bear fruit. Ask the gardener or the arborist. Results help us to build graphs and show people, but fruit nurtures our physical bodies and gives us energy to survive and to live. And if you evaluate a ministry that you have based on the fruit it produces to nurture others, to pour out expensive things on the heads of those we encounter, then you're doing what you should. If your efforts have been directed towards the nourishment of the soul of others and enriched by your intention, then God will bless it. Do you see where the attitude towards the poor and this extravagant waste play into one another? Jesus is saying, it's not all about efficiency. You need to figure out how to take care of the poor the way this woman is taking care of me. It's important for right now. He even rebukes his disciples. He says, why do you trouble this woman? She'll be remembered for this act. And here we are, July 5th, 2020, remembering her act of extravagant, lavish grace towards Jesus. And in this example, he asks us to do the same for the people around us. I hope you have had a joyous and hopefully somewhat uplifting 4th of July holiday. And I hope you remember that we live in a country with liberty and justice for all, that is our goal, that the alabaster jars we break on the heads of those we encounter are an important part of being a disciple of Jesus. May God bless you.